My name is Raymond Calloway. For 35 years, I was a federal judge. I never expected to find a lie at my own dinner table. Then a 16-year-old boy knocked on my study door holding a cracked phone. My son-in-law was planning to have me declared incompetent. My doctor had signed papers for an exam that never happened. And my wife's voice was on that recording. Scripture says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." This is that story. The coffee had gone lukewarm by the time I noticed, which told me I'd been sitting at my desk for longer than I intended. That had been happening more often since I retired, the mornings stretching out like taffy, slow and formless, nothing to pull me forward into the day. 35 years on the federal bench had trained my body to be somewhere specific at a specific time. Now the only appointment I kept was with a ceramic mug and the Nashville Tennessean. And even that I managed to miss. It was a Tuesday in October. The light coming through the study windows was the particular gold of Tennessee autumn, the kind that makes everything look slightly more meaningful than it probably is. Outside the grounds of the Belmead property were doing what they always did in October, turning slowly and beautifully toward dormancy. The oaks dropping their leaves in no particular hurry. James moving between the rows with his rake in that steady, unhurried way he had. I had watched him work those grounds for 12 years without once learning the name of the song he hummed while he did it. I was thinking about nothing in particular. That was the honest answer, though it was not an answer I would have given easily 6 months ago, when thinking about nothing felt like a symptom of something. Now I understood it was simply what retirement looked like from the inside. A large, quiet house and a man sitting in it trying to remember what he used to want. My wife, Margaret, had already gone to her garden club meeting. My son-in-law, Derek, had left for his office in downtown Nashville before 7, briefcase in hand, the particular briskness of a man who has places to be. I had heard his car in the driveway and felt, as I sometimes did, the low-grade discomfort of a man who could not name what bothered him about another man. Derek was successful, well-spoken, and unfailingly polite to me. I had no evidence of anything else. Dr. Whitmore had called the previous Friday to confirm my quarterly check-in for the following week. I had forgotten to write it down and made a mental note to ask Margaret to add it to the calendar. I was reaching for the mug when the knock came. It was not the knock of someone who was uncertain whether to knock. It was 2 solid raps, the kind that commit. I set the mug down and turned toward the study door, which I had left half open, as I always did when the house was otherwise empty. The boy was standing in the doorway, 16 years old, give or take. I placed him by height and by the particular quality of stillness that belongs to young men who have learned to make themselves unobtrusive in spaces where adults conduct business. He was wearing a dark green jacket that was a size too large in the shoulders, and there was mud on his boots, the fresh, specific mud of the lower garden where the drainage ran slow after rain. He was James's boy, I knew that much. I had seen him moving through the grounds on weekends and school holidays, sometimes helping his father, sometimes sitting alone against the garden wall with a book open on his knees. I did not know his name. What I knew was his eyes. I had spent 35 years watching people decide whether to speak the truth in a room where speaking it costs something. There is a particular quality to a person's face in the moment before they commit to honesty. A kind of settling, the way a building stops shifting after an earthquake and simply stands in its new position. I had seen it in witnesses, in defendants, in lawyers who had just discovered the evidence was not what they thought it was. I had seen it in good people and in people who were not good at all. Because honesty does not discriminate. The boy standing in my doorway had that quality. He had made his decision before he knocked. Whatever he was about to say, he had been carrying it for some time, and had chosen this morning, this door, to put it down. "Good morning," I said. "Can I help you?" Judge Calloway. His voice was steady, which surprised me. Most people, when they call me by that title, soften around it, make it apologetic, the way people treat the names of the recently deceased. He said it straight. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I'm Darnell, James Cooper's son." "I know who you are," I said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. "Come in and sit down." He came in and sat in the chair across from my desk. The chair where over 35 years of bringing work home, I had watched prosecutors rehearse arguments, watched colleagues wrestle with decisions, watched my daughter Claire do homework with the focused seriousness she had applied to everything since she was 8 years old. Darnell Cooper sat in it the way those people had sat in it, upright, with the weight of something specific pressing him forward. I waited. Waiting is a skill that the bench teaches thoroughly. Most people, given enough silence, will fill it with the truth. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to hear me out before you decide what to think about it. Because I know how it sounds, and I know I'm the groundskeeper's kid, and I know that's not Darnell." I kept my voice level. I spent 35 years letting people finish their sentences before I made up my mind. Start from the beginning. He reached into the pocket of the too large jacket and produced a phone. It was old, the kind of older model with a cracked screen, held together at one corner by a strip of clear tape. The kind of phone that gets handed down when someone upgrades. He set it on the desk between us, with the careful precision of a person placing something fragile. "I recorded something," he said, 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what to do with it. I almost deleted it 4 times. He paused. I didn't because I kept thinking, if it were my family, I'd want to know. I looked at the phone on my desk. The crack in the screen ran from the upper left corner down to the center, branching once like a river delta. Outside the window, I could hear James's rake moving through the leaves. Steady, unhurried, the way it always sounded. The gold October light was still coming through the glass. Everything in the room was exactly where it had been 10 minutes ago. "Judge Calloway," Darnell said, and his voice did not waver. "I think Mr. Holt is trying to take your house." I did not reach for the phone immediately. That was deliberate. In 35 years on the bench, I had learned that the first response to unexpected information is almost never the right one. The instinct is to react, to question, to deny, to demand clarification. The discipline is to be still long enough to let the information settle into its actual shape before you decide what it means. So I looked at the phone on my desk for a moment. Then I looked at Darnell Cooper, who was sitting across from me with his hands folded in his lap, not fidgeting, not looking away. He had the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and was now simply waiting for it to proceed. "Before I listen to this," I said, "tell me how you came to record it." He told me plainly, without embellishment. 3 weeks ago, on a Wednesday evening, he had been in the garden after dark, finishing a section of drainage work his father had asked him to complete before the next rain. The patio lights were on. He had heard voices, Mr. Holt's voice, and a second voice he did not recognize, coming from the far side of the stone terrace, the section that ran along the east wing of the house. He had not meant to listen. He had moved closer because he thought at first it might be his father, and his father had mentioned a pulled muscle that week, and he had not wanted the man working alone in the dark. It was not his father. He had stood very still for approximately 2 minutes before he understood enough of what he was hearing to know that he should not be hearing it. Then he had taken out his phone and pressed record. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. "I thought about it every day," he said. "I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was, I don't know, something legitimate, a legal thing I didn't understand." He paused. "But then, last week, I saw Dr. Whitmore come to the house. He didn't come to the front door. He went around to the east entrance, the one off the garden. And he and Mr. Holt were inside for almost an hour. I kept my face still. Dr. Whitmore used the east entrance sometimes when he came for informal visits. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that I had no memory of a visit last week. "All right," I said. I picked up the phone. The recording quality was what you would expect from an older device, held at distance by a 16-year-old trying not to be seen. Ambient noise, the faint sound of wind through the garden, the stone terrace giving the voices a slight, hollow quality. But the words were clear enough. Derek's voice came first. I had heard my son-in-law's voice at dinner tables and holiday gatherings for 11 years. I knew its rhythms, the particular confidence of a man who had decided early in life that he was the smartest person in most rooms, and had been rewarded often enough that the decision had calcified into certainty. On the recording, that confidence was still present, but stripped of its social function. This was not the voice Derek used at dinner parties. This was a working voice, precise and without warmth. He was discussing a timeline. The words competency evaluation appeared within the first 30 seconds. Then the phrase medical documentation. Then a name, Hammond, which meant nothing to me, followed by a reference to Dr. Whitmore that made the skin across my shoulders tighten in a way I recognized from decades of testimony. It was the tightening that came when a fact you had accepted as solid was quietly reclassified as a question. The second voice was male, older, careful in the specific way of men who have spent significant time ensuring their words could not be used against them. He mentioned a filing deadline. He mentioned the phrase, petition for guardianship. He mentioned a court date that was less than 2 weeks away. I turned the volume up slightly. The second voice said the words, evidence files, and I stopped breathing for exactly 1 second before I resumed and continued listening. Then Margaret's voice came through the speaker. It was brief. She was clearly not the primary participant in this conversation, more a presence on its periphery. She asked a question I could not fully make out. Derek's response was patient, in the way that people are patient when they have already decided the outcome and are simply managing the remaining steps. He said something that included the words, for his own protection. And then Margaret said something that I could hear clearly, because she had moved closer to wherever Darnell was standing. She said, I just want to make sure this is the right thing. There was a quality in her voice that I had heard before in 35 years of listening to people speak under pressure. It was the voice of someone who has been given a reason to do something they are not entirely comfortable doing, and who is asking the question not because they expect a different answer, but because they need to hear the reason one more time. Derek said, It is. It's the only thing. And Margaret said nothing else. I stopped the recording at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The room was very quiet. Outside, James's rake had gone still. He had moved to a different section of the grounds, and I could no longer hear him. The October light through the windows had not changed. It was still gold, still slow, still making everything look slightly more significant than it might otherwise be. I set the phone on the desk between us. Darnell was watching me with the particular attention of a young person trying to read an adult's face for information the adult is not yet prepared to give. I had 4 grandsons. I recognized the look. You've carried this alone for 3 weeks, I said. Yes, sir. You didn't tell your father. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but its close neighbor. He would have told me to stay out of it. He worries about... He stopped. Started again. He worries about the job. I understood what he was not saying. I would come back to it. How long did you know, I asked, before you decided to come to me? Darnell looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. I knew the first night. I just didn't know if you'd believe me. He paused. or if believing me would matter. It was one of the more precise diagnoses of institutional trust I had heard in some time, and I had spent a career surrounded by lawyers. "How old are you?" I asked. 16, sir. I nodded. I looked at the phone on the desk, at the crack running down its screen like a fault line, at the small strip of tape holding one corner together. "How long have you been carrying this?" I asked. 3 weeks, sir, he said. "Since the night Mr. Holt met the doctor in the garden." I stood at the study window for a long time after Darnell finished speaking. Derek was in the south garden, moving along the stone path that curved toward the back gate. He was wearing the charcoal overcoat he favored on cool mornings, hands in his pockets, unhurried. From this distance, he looked exactly as he always had, composed, deliberate, a man with a clear sense of where he was going. He stopped at the iron bench near the hedgerow and checked his phone, read something, typed a brief response. Then he continued walking. He did not look toward the house. I watched him until he rounded the far corner of the garden wall and disappeared from view. Then I turned back to the room. "Tell me what else you observed," I said. "In those 3 weeks. Everything you remember in the order you remember it." Darnell told me. He was a good witness. I recognized it within the first 2 minutes. The quality of attention he brought to detail. The way he distinguished between what he had seen directly and what he had inferred. The care he took not to overstate. He did not say Derek had done something. He said he had seen Derek do something, and then describe what he had seen. It was a distinction most adults in a courtroom failed to maintain under oath. Over 3 weeks, Darnell had observed the following. Derek had made 4 visits to the house at times when he would not normally be present. Twice on weekday afternoons when Margaret was out. Once on a Saturday morning when Raymond was at his cardiologist in Brentwood. Once very late on a Thursday evening. On each of the first 3 visits, Derek had brought a leather document case that he had not brought on ordinary family visits. On the Thursday evening visit, he had been accompanied by a man Darnell had not recognized. Medium height, gray suit. The manner of someone accustomed to being in rooms where decisions were made. "This man," I said. "Did you get a clear look at him?" "Enough," Darnell said. He was older, maybe 60. He had a way of standing that reminded me of... He paused, searching for the word. Like he was always slightly turned away from whatever he was looking at. Does that make sense? It made considerable sense. It was the posture of a man who had spent a long time being careful about what he could be seen to be paying attention to. "Go on," I said. On the second of the weekday visits, Darnell had been working in the east garden and had been close enough to the study window to hear voices without being able to make out words. He had heard Derek's voice and a third voice, not the gray-suited man, a different one, older still, with the specific regional flatness of someone who had grown up in Middle Tennessee and had never entirely left it behind, regardless of how far they had traveled since. That voice Derek had addressed by name on one occasion that Darnell had caught. He called him Senator, Darnell said. I did not move from the window. "Just Senator," I said. "No last name." Once, at the end, when they were leaving, Darnell's voice was careful. He said, "I'll have everything ready before Thursday, Senator Briggs." The name settled into the room the way heavy objects settle, without drama, without announcement, simply by virtue of their weight. Senator Harlan Briggs. 12 years in the Tennessee State Senate, 3 terms. The kind of political longevity that does not happen by accident. The kind that requires the careful and systematic elimination of obstacles over a very long period of time. I had been accumulating documentation on Senator Briggs for 8 years, quietly, without telling anyone, without being entirely certain what I intended to do with it when the file was complete. It was not yet complete. I had told myself it was not yet complete because the evidence was not yet sufficient. I had not examined too carefully whether that was the truth. The file was in my study safe, 40 pages, 8 years of careful accumulation. I had not opened it in 14 months. I became aware that Darnell was watching me, with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything else this morning. Patient, precise, waiting. "You've done well," I said. It was not what I had intended to say, but it was true. And the truth seemed to be what this particular morning required. Carrying something like this for 3 weeks at your age without telling anyone, that takes a certain kind of steadiness. Darnell looked at his hands briefly. "My dad taught me that if you see something wrong and you don't say anything, you're part of it, even if you didn't start it." He paused. I didn't want to be part of it. I thought about James Cooper in the South Garden, moving between the oak rows with his rake, humming a song whose name I did not know. 12 years of reliable presence. I had never thought to ask him very much about himself. "Senator Briggs," I said more to myself than to Darnell. I moved to my desk and sat down. "Did you hear his name mentioned in the recording as well?" "No, sir. Just in person, that one time." I looked at the far wall of the study where the safe was built into the shelving, behind a row of federal reporters, the bound volumes of judicial decisions that had lined my walls for so long they had become part of the room's architecture, as unnoticed as the baseboards. 40 pages. 8 years. "Judge Calloway," Darnell said. "Give me a moment," I said. He gave me the moment without question, which told me something about him that I filed away alongside everything else he had shown me this morning. I thought about what it meant that Harlan Briggs's name had come out of Derek Holt's mouth in this house. I thought about the safe behind the federal reporters and what was inside it. I thought about the fact that someone had known enough about my morning routines, my medical appointments, and the layout of my property to send a man in a gray suit through my East Garden entrance on a Tuesday afternoon. Then I thought about the fact that I had signed off on Derek Holt's presence in this family 11 years ago, in a church in Green Hills, standing at the end of a long aisle, watching my daughter walk toward a man I had decided, based on a firm handshake and good eye contact, was worth trusting. 35 years on the federal bench, and it turned out I had done my least careful work at home. "There's something I need to check," I said. I stood up. "Stay here." The safe was behind the third shelf from the bottom, behind a row of bound federal reporters that I had not opened in years and had no intention of opening. They were there for the same reason that certain things are kept visible, not because they are consulted, but because their presence communicates something about the person who owns them. The combination was a date I would not forget. I had set it the year I was appointed to the bench, on the logic that a man should choose numbers that will not require him to write them down. I moved the reporters aside one by one and set them on the floor. Darnell watched from the chair without speaking. The safe door was flush with the wall. A good installation, nothing that announced itself. I had paid for discretion, and I had received it. I entered the combination and pulled the handle. The first thing I noticed was that the door moved differently than it should have. It was subtle. The door opened. The mechanism performed its function. The contents were intact and in the order I had left them 14 months ago. But there was a faint scoring on the lower left edge of the door frame, a thin line, barely perceptible, the kind left by a tool that had been applied with care and then withdrawn before it accomplished its purpose. Someone had tried to open the safe and had not succeeded. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I removed the contents and carried them to my desk. The file was 41 pages, which surprised me. I had remembered 40, which meant I had added a page at some point and then forgotten the addition. The pages were organized chronologically, oldest at the back, most recent at the front. The most recent edition was dated 16 months ago, which placed it shortly before my retirement. The subject was Senator Harlan Briggs of the Tennessee State Legislature, and the file contained 8 years of documentation that I had assembled in the incremental, patient way of a man who understood that evidence does not present itself fully formed. "Sit down," I told Darnell, who had moved to stand near the desk. "I'm going to tell you some of this, not all of it. Enough so you understand what we're dealing with." He sat. I told him what I could. Senator Briggs had been the subject of 3 separate federal inquiries over 12 years each, of which had concluded without indictment. The pattern in each case was the same. Witnesses who had initially agreed to cooperate subsequently declined key documentation that had been confirmed as existing was later reported as missing. And the investigations had wound down in the particular way that investigations wind down when the obstacle is not insufficient evidence, but insufficient willingness to pursue it. I had observed the pattern from the bench. I had assembled the documentation. I had waited for the moment when it would be possible to act on it. The moment had not yet arrived. And now it appeared that Senator Briggs had grown tired of waiting. Darnell listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So Mr. Holt isn't just after the house," he said. "No," I said. "He is not. He's after what's in that file." "That would be my current assessment, yes." Darnell looked at the pages on my desk, then back at me. "Does my dad know about this? About Senator Briggs?" "No," I said. "No one knows. That was the point." I reached for the phone on my desk. Not the old cracked device that still sat where Darnell had placed it, but my own. I opened the contact list and found the name I was looking for near the bottom of the W entries. Franklin Webb. We had not spoken in 4 years. Not since a retirement dinner that had been cordial, in the way that retirement dinners between men who respect each other are. Cordial, brief, honest, without sentiment. Franklin was 63 years old and had been a federal prosecutor for the better part of 3 decades. He was thorough, he was careful, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. I pressed call. While the phone rang, I looked again at the scoring on the safe door. The tool marks were thin and precise, not the work of an amateur. Someone who knew what they were doing had applied a specific instrument to that frame and had stopped before the job was complete, either because they were interrupted or because they had decided the risk was not yet worth taking. Either way, they knew the safe existed. They knew approximately what it contained, and they had decided that removing me from the picture was preferable to attempting to remove the file directly. Franklin answered on the 3rd ring. "Raymond," he said. His voice had not changed, the particular flat precision of a man who spent his working life stripping language of everything that was not necessary. "It's been a while." "It has," I said. "Franklin, I need you to listen without interrupting. I'll be as brief as I can." "Go ahead." I reported the facts in the order a prosecutor would want them. Chronological, specific, without editorializing. Darnell Cooper, 16 years old. Audio recording 3 weeks prior. Derek Holt on the East Terrace. Medical documentation, competency evaluation. Petition for guardianship. Senator Briggs' name spoken on the grounds of my property by my son-in-law. The safe and the scoring on the door frame. The file inside it. 41 pages. 8 years. Franklin was silent for 4 seconds after I finished. In my experience, a 4-second silence from Franklin Webb meant he was reorganizing everything he thought he knew about a situation. "The file," he said. "Is it complete?" "Complete enough," I said. Another silence. Shorter this time. "Raymond," he said. "When did Dr. Whitmore last come to your house?" I looked at Darnell. "Last week," I said. "The east entrance. He and Derek were inside for nearly an hour." "Did you know about the visit in advance?" "I did not." Franklin's voice did not change in any way that most people would have noticed. But I had known him for 22 years, and I heard what was underneath it. "We need to talk in person," he said. "Not by phone." "I know," I said. "Raymond." He paused. "They already tried to get into the safe." "Yes," I said. "They did, which means they already know what's inside." I looked at the scoring on the door frame one more time. Thin, precise, careful. The work of someone who had specific instructions and had followed them with professional attention. Which means, I said, we're out of time. Franklin had said he would come in person, and that had ended the call. I set the phone on the desk and sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a conversation in which everything important has been said and nothing has been resolved. Darnell was watching me from across the desk. He had the good sense not to speak. There's one more call I need to make, I said. I want you to stay and listen. You may hear things that are difficult to sit with. I need you to remain quiet, regardless of what you hear. He nodded once. I found Dr. Whitmore's number in my contacts. Gerald Whitmore, 61 years old, family practice physician with a clinic on West End Avenue. I had been his patient for 20 years, since the year after my first cardiac event, when my previous doctor had retired and a colleague had recommended Whitmore. As thorough, unhurried, and disinclined to treat patients as problems to be efficiently processed. All three of those qualities had proven accurate. In 20 years, Whitmore had seen me through a second cardiac scare, a knee replacement, and the particular constellation of minor ailments that accumulate in a man's 60s like sediment. He had sat beside me in the waiting room when Margaret's procedure ran long and the nurse could not find us to give an update. He had called me personally, not through his office, when my blood work from 18 months ago had shown a result that warranted discussion. I had trusted him in the way you trust a person who has access to the parts of your life that require someone to be trustworthy. I pressed call and waited. He answered on the second ring, which was not unusual. Whitmore kept his own phone for patient calls and answered it himself during clinic hours, rather than routing through a receptionist. It was one of the things I had always appreciated about him. "Raymond," he said. The warmth in his voice was familiar and immediate. "I was going to call you this week about scheduling. How are you feeling?" "Not bad," I said. My voice was the voice I used in court level, unhurried, giving nothing. "Gerald, I wanted to follow up on the appointment last week. The results you mentioned." A pause. Brief, perhaps, half a second. If I had not been listening for it specifically, I would not have caught it. "Of course," he said. "Yes, the results." "The tremor indicators," I said. "You said early stage. I wanted to understand more about what that means going forward." Another pause. Longer this time. I heard him shift the sound of a man in a chair adjusting his position, which people do when they need a moment to think. "Well," he said, "the indicators we discussed were preliminary, Raymond. I want to be careful not to overstate what we're seeing at this stage. It's important to contextualize the findings within the broader picture of your overall health." He was reading from something. I had listened to enough evasive testimony in 35 years to recognize the particular cadence of a person whose words were arriving from a source other than memory or genuine knowledge. The sentences were too constructed. The qualifications were too evenly distributed. A doctor speaking from genuine recollection of a patient encounter does not sound like a man reading a prepared statement. He sounds like a man remembering. "Gerald," I said, "where did the tremor present? Left hand or right?" A third pause, longer than the second. "The assessment noted bilateral indicators," he said. "More pronounced on the left side at the time of evaluation." I looked at my left hand resting on the desk. It was completely still. It had been completely still as far as I was aware for 68 years. "And the cognitive component," I said. "The memory assessment. I've been trying to recall, did we do that as part of the same appointment, or was that a separate visit?" I heard him draw breath. I believe that was conducted as part of the comprehensive evaluation. We covered several areas." "I see," I said. "Gerald, what day was that appointment?" The pause this time was the longest yet. 4 seconds. 5. "I'd have to check my records," he said carefully. I don't want to give you an incorrect date from memory. Of course, I said. Take your time. He did not take his time. He said, I believe it was a Tuesday. The Tuesday before last. I looked across the desk at Darnell, who was sitting very still, his eyes on my face. The Tuesday before last, I had driven to Knoxville for a meeting with a former colleague who was consulting on a civil rights case and had asked for my perspective on a jurisdictional question. I had left Belle Meade at 7:30 in the morning and returned after 9 in the evening. I had told Margaret where I was going. I had not, as I rarely did with routine professional matters, mentioned it to Derek. I had not been in Gerald Whitmore's clinic on that Tuesday. I had not been in Nashville at all. I had not taken any cognitive assessment. I had not had my hands observed for tremor indicators. I had not sat in the chair across from a man I had trusted for 20 years and answered questions about my memory. Thank you, Gerald, I said. That's helpful. I'll be in touch about the follow-up. I ended the call before he could respond. The room was quiet. The October light had shifted slightly. It was past 9 now, and the gold had become something more ordinary. Just morning light, doing what morning light does. Outside, I could hear James's rake again, moving through a new section of the grounds. I set the phone on the desk. 20 years. The knee replacement. The cardiac scares. The waiting room when Margaret's procedure ran long. The personal call about the blood work. 20 years of a man who had had access to the most private facts of my physical existence and who had just spent 45 seconds trying to describe an appointment that had never taken place. Judge Calloway, Darnell said quietly. He said the test showed early-stage tremors, I said. My voice was still level. I was grateful for 35 years of practice. I never took any tests last Tuesday, Darnell. I paused. I was in Knoxville. Darnell said nothing. He did not need to. I sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it. The particular grief that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. Because somewhere beneath the 20 years of trust, beneath the waiting room and the personal calls and the careful, unhurried manner, I had registered something this morning that I had not yet allowed myself to name. The pause after I said tremor indicators. The constructed sentences. The moment when a man who had known my medical history for 2 decades had needed to think before he could tell me which hand had trembled. I had known before I ended the call. I had simply needed to hear it, clearly enough to be certain. All right, I said. I straightened the file on my desk. Let's talk about what we do next. The daytime address book was in the bottom drawer of my desk, where it had been for 19 years. It was a standard professional directory, burgundy leather cover, worn smooth at the corners. The spine cracked from use in the years when I had consulted it regularly, and then left to stiffen in the years when I had not. I had transferred most of its contents to my phone contacts a decade ago, but I had kept the book because there were names in it that I had not transferred. Names that belonged to a category of professional relationship that did not sit easily in a digital contact list. Names associated with matters that I had preferred for various reasons to keep off any system that could be accessed remotely. Franklin Webb's number was on the 3rd page of the W section. I had written it in the book by hand, which meant it predated my phone contacts, and went back to a time when Franklin and I had worked in closer proximity, the years of parallel federal work, when his office and my courtroom had shared a building and an understanding of how each other operated. I had already spoken to him once this morning, briefly, to establish the basic facts. That call had ended with his agreement to come in person. But in the 40 minutes since I had confirmed something that changed the scope of what I needed to tell him, I dialed. He answered before the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. Gerald Whitmore, I said without preamble. He conducted a medical evaluation of me that did not take place. He described an appointment on a Tuesday when I was in Knoxville. He described findings, tremor indicators, cognitive assessment, from an examination that never happened. A silence on Franklin's end. Not the 4-second silence of reorganization from earlier. This was the silence of a man confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "How long has Whitmore been your physician?" he asked. 20 years. "And his relationship to Derek Holt? Do you know of any prior connection?" "Not before this morning," I said. I'm working on it," Franklin said. "Raymond, I need to tell you something. I should have told you in the first call. I didn't say it then because I wasn't certain enough. I'm more certain now." "Go ahead." "Derek Holt," he said. "I've had reason to look into him before. Not in connection with you, in connection with a separate matter involving state-level financial irregularities that crossed into federal territory 18 months ago. His name appeared in documentation that I reviewed and then set aside when the matter was resolved through other means." He paused. At the time, his connection to the primary subject of that investigation seemed peripheral. I did not pursue it. The primary subject. I already knew who that was, but I let Franklin arrive at it in his own sequence. "The primary subject," he said, "was Senator Harlan Briggs. I had been expecting it. Expecting it did not make it smaller." "How long?" I said. "Between Derek and Briggs, at minimum 3 years, Franklin said. "Possibly longer, but 3 years is what the documentation supports. Regular meetings not logged through official channels. Financial transfers through a Delaware LLC that lists Derek as a registered agent. Small amounts. Small enough to look like consulting fees, if anyone looked, which suggests someone anticipated that someone might look." I looked at the file on my desk. 41 pages. 8 years of patient accumulation, and I had missed the branch that led directly to my own dining room table. "He came through Margaret," I said. It was not a question. "That's the sequence the documentation suggests," Franklin said carefully. "Derek made initial contact with your wife at a Nashville Bar Association event, approximately 13 months before he met your daughter. His attendance at that event was not, as far as I can determine, incidental." 13 months. Derek had spent 13 months building a relationship with Margaret before he had ever appeared in Claire's life. He had been patient and thorough, and he had understood with the particular intelligence of a man who studies his targets carefully that the way into Raymond Calloway's household was not through Raymond Calloway directly. It was through the people Raymond Calloway trusted. "Claire," I said. My voice came out level. I was grateful in a remote and mechanical way for the training that made level possible in moments when level was not what I felt. "Your daughter appears to have been approached genuinely," Franklin said. "There's no documentation suggesting the relationship was manufactured from her side or managed from his, in the way that his connection to Margaret was managed. Whether that distinction provides any comfort is not something I can assess. It provided a specific kind of comfort and a specific kind of additional grief simultaneously, which was a combination I did not have time to examine at the moment." "The file in my safe," I said. "Briggs knows what's in it. He knows it exists," Franklin said. "Whether he knows the specifics depends on how much Whitmore has been able to assess from his visits to your property. My assumption would be that Briggs knows enough to want it removed and enough to know that removing you is more efficient than removing the file, given that you're the only person who knows where it is and what it means." The scoring on the safe door. The failed attempt. The pivot to a different approach. "When can you be here?" I said. "This afternoon," Franklin said. 4 o'clock. "Raymond, one more thing." "Go ahead." "When you speak to Margaret today, and I assume you will speak to her today, I would advise you to be careful about how much you tell her and in what sequence. Not because I have reason to doubt her, but because people who have been managed carefully over a long period of time respond better to information delivered in a specific order. She's been prepared for a particular version of events. Receiving a contradictory version all at once can produce reactions that are not always predictable. I thought about Margaret's voice on the recording. The particular quality of it, not the voice of a conspirator, not the voice of a woman who had made a decision and was living cleanly with it. The voice of a woman who had been given a reason to do something and was asking to hear the reason one more time. "I understand," I said. 4 o'clock, Franklin said. The call ended. I set the phone on the desk and looked at Darnell, who had maintained his careful silence throughout. He was watching me with the same patient attention he had brought to the morning, and I thought again that he was a remarkable young man, and that I had walked past him in the garden for 3 years without registering that fact. "Mr. Holt has been working for Senator Briggs for at least 3 years, I said. "He came into this family through my wife, through deliberate, patient cultivation of a connection that would eventually bring him to this house and to what is in that safe." Darnell was quiet for a moment. "What do we do now?" he asked. I looked at the file at the phone, at the scored edge of the safe door visible across the room. "Now," I said, "we wait for Franklin. And while we wait, I need to think very carefully about my daughter." Derek reappeared in the south garden at 10:43. I know the time because I had been watching the garden intermittently since our conversation ended, and I had noted the moment he came back into view with the particular attention I had been applying to everything this morning. Not the passive observation of a man with nowhere to be, but the deliberate cataloging of a man who understood that what he was seeing now was evidence. He had changed into a lighter jacket. He was carrying his phone loosely in one hand, and he walked with the unhurried confidence of a man whose morning had gone according to plan. He stopped near the elm at the garden's center and said something to James, who had moved to that section with his rake. James responded. I could not hear the exchange from the study window, but I could see the body language. James nodded, the small, accommodating nod of an employee receiving a pleasant remark from a family member of his employer. Derek smiled. It was a good smile. It had always been a good smile. 11 years I had watched that smile across dinner tables and holiday gatherings, and the small ordinary moments that accumulate into a family's shared life. I had never found a specific reason to distrust it. I had filed it instead in the category of things about Derek Holt that I could not entirely account for, but could not specifically object to. A category that had grown, I now understood, because I had been applying the wrong standard. I had been looking for reasons to distrust him rather than reasons to trust him. Which sounds like the same exercise, but is not. Tell me about Claire, I said. Darnell, who had been sitting quietly while I stood at the window, shifted in his chair. What would you like to know? What you've observed. In the same way you told me about the other things. What you've seen, separated from what you've concluded. He thought for a moment before he spoke, which I had come to recognize as characteristic of him. He did not reach for words before he had them. She's here about once a month, he said. Sometimes twice. Usually on weekends. When Mr. Holt comes with her, they don't spend much time in the same room. Not arguing, just not together. She goes to the garden a lot, alone. My dad says she used to do that when she was young, before she was married. That she'd come out to the garden and just sit. I had not known that. Margaret would have known it. I had been in my study during those visits, or on the phone, or reviewing case files that no longer needed reviewing because I was retired and there were no more case files. I had been in the habit of my working life long after the work had ended. And recently, I said, in the last few months. She seems tired, Darnell said carefully. Not sick tired, more like carrying something. He paused. Last Sunday, she was in the far garden, the section by the stone wall. I was on the other side, finishing the winter pruning. She didn't know I was there. She was on the phone. He stopped. Go on, I said. She was speaking quietly, he said. I didn't hear most of it. But I heard her say, "I don't know what he's doing, but something is wrong." And then she said, "I can't talk to Dad about it yet. I don't have anything real to tell him." I turned from the window. The chair where Darnell was sitting was the chair where Claire had done her homework at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, through the years when she had been small enough that her feet didn't reach the floor, and she would sit with them tucked under her, a posture that drove Margaret to mild distraction and that I had secretly found charming. She had grown out of it gradually, the way children grow out of things without announcement, until one day you notice the feet are on the floor, and you cannot remember when the change happened. I thought about her voice on the phone in the far garden. The particular exhaustion of a person who has known for some time that something is wrong, and has not yet found the shape of it clearly enough to name it to anyone else. She had been carrying this for at least as long as Darnell had been carrying his recording. Possibly longer. "Did you hear anything else?" I asked. "She said one more thing," Darnell said. "She said he's not who I thought he was. And then whoever she was talking to said something, and she just said, 'I know.' And then she stopped talking and stood there for a while, looking at the wall." I looked at the wall of books across the study. The federal reporters, the safe behind them. My daughter had been standing in my garden 6 days ago, speaking those words into a phone. And I had been 15 feet away, on the other side of a stone wall, not knowing she was there. "She didn't tell you," Darnell said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said, "she did not." "Why do you think that is?" It was a direct question, the kind that a more socially calibrated 16-year-old might have hesitated to ask a 68-year-old former federal judge. Darnell asked it with the straightforwardness of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, and had decided that directness was more respectful than circumspection. I considered the question honestly. "Because she wasn't certain enough yet," I said. "And because she knows me well enough to know that I don't respond well to uncertainty presented as fact. I require evidence." I paused. "She learned that from watching me work for 35 years. It's possible I taught her the wrong lesson about when to speak." Darnell did not respond to that. He seemed to understand that it was not a statement that required a response. Outside, Derek had finished his conversation with James and was walking back toward the house. He moved with the same unhurried confidence as before. He did not look up at the study window. He had no reason to. I made a decision. "I'm not going to call her yet," I said. "Not today. Not until Franklin has been here and I understand more completely what I'm going to tell her." I paused. When you tell someone their life has been arranged around a lie, the sequence in which you tell them matters. You do not begin in the middle. Darnell nodded slowly. "You begin at the beginning," he said. "You begin," I said, "with what you can prove." I heard her on the stairs at 11:50. 38 years of marriage teaches a man things he does not know he has learned until he has tested on them. The sound of his wife's footsteps on a staircase is one of those things, not something you study or catalog, just something that enters you through the accumulation of ordinary mornings and becomes indistinguishable from the house itself, from the particular creaking of the third step and the way the sound changes when she is carrying something versus when her hands are free. Margaret's step was medium-paced today, unhurried, hands free. She had come down from the bedroom, which meant she had returned from her garden club meeting while I was on the phone with Franklin, and had gone upstairs to change clothes before lunch, which was her habit. I told Darnell to go to the kitchen and tell Gloria, our housekeeper, that he was helping me with some garden documentation and would be in the study for the afternoon. It was a sufficient explanation. Gloria had seen stranger arrangements in 38 years of working for a federal judge. Then I went to meet my wife for lunch, as I had done on 10,000 ordinary days. The dining room faced the south garden. The October light was coming through the tall windows in a way that caught the edge of the tablecloth and made the silver coffee service glow in that specific afternoon manner it had. The manner that had always made the room look more formal than we intended it to be. Margaret was already at the table, pouring water from the carafe. She was wearing the blue cardigan she kept for home days, the one with the small repair on the left cuff that she had done herself with slightly mismatched thread, because she liked the cardigan too much to discard it and had never gotten around to taking it to a tailor. She looked in that moment exactly as she had looked on 10,000 ordinary days. I sat down across from her. The discipline required to sit across from a person you have known for 38 years, a person whose voice you heard on a recording 3 hours ago, discussing arrangements for your legal incapacitation, and to pass the breadbasket and ask about her morning. That discipline is not something I had been specifically trained for. The bench trains you to maintain composure in the face of information. It does not train you to maintain composure in the face of the person the information is about. Sitting across from you over a lunch that she has prepared or supervised the preparation of, looking at you with the ordinary concern of a wife who has noticed her husband is quiet. I watched her the way I had watched witnesses. Not obviously, you learn early that obvious observation changes what you are observing. I watched the way she held her water glass, the way she reached for the bread, the angle of her head when she spoke. I listened not just to the words, but to the architecture beneath them, the structure of what she chose to say and what she chose not to say, and how the choosing revealed itself in the spaces between. She told me about the garden club meeting. There had been a disagreement about the spring planting schedule. Eleanor Marsh had been characteristically inflexible, and Margaret had exercised the particular diplomatic patience she deployed with Eleanor, which was different from her general patience, and which she had refined over 20 years of garden club membership into something close to an art form. She told me this with the mild amusement of a woman recounting a familiar irritation, and her voice was exactly as it always was, warm, specific, unhurried. I listened, and I compared. The voice on the recording had been different. Not dramatically. The difference was not the difference between two different women, but the difference between the same woman in two different states. In the recording, Margaret's voice had the quality I had identified this morning as the voice of someone asking to hear a reason one more time. It was not the voice of a woman who had decided. It was the voice of a woman who was being led toward a decision and who was moving in the direction she was being led because the person leading her had given her a reason she could not immediately argue with. There is a difference between a woman who has chosen to betray her husband and a woman who has been given a version of events in which what she is doing is not betrayal. The first knows. The second has been carefully prevented from knowing. I was watching Margaret reach for the bread, and I was thinking about that difference when she looked up and found me watching her. She did not look away. "Raymond," she said. Her voice was quiet, with the specific quality it took on when she was concerned about something she had not yet found the words for. "Are you all right? You seem distant today." It was such an ordinary question. The kind of question that belongs to the landscape of a long marriage. The kind that gets asked across breakfast tables and in hallways. And on the particular kind of afternoon when one person in a marriage senses that the other has gone somewhere internal and is not certain how to ask about it directly. I looked at her face. I looked at the small repair on the left cuff of the blue cardigan. I looked at the way she was holding her water glass slightly tighter than necessary, which was what she did when she was genuinely worried, which was different from the way she held it when she was performing worry. She was not performing. The concern in her eyes was the concern of a woman who had noticed her husband was not where he usually was emotionally on an ordinary Tuesday, and who was asking about it from a place of genuine attention. It was the same concern she had shown during the cardiac scares, during the difficult years of a particular case that had weighed on me for a full year during the weeks after my mother died, and I had not been good at letting anyone help me through it. Whatever Margaret knew, whatever she had been told, whatever she had signed or agreed to or been persuaded to accept, She did not know that I knew. And beneath that, there was something more important. She did not know about Senator Briggs. She did not know the real reason Derek had entered this household. She did not know that what she believed she was participating in, and what she was actually participating in, were two entirely different arrangements. That was not the posture of a woman who had made a clear-eyed choice. That was the posture of a woman who had been managed. "I'm fine," I said. I reached across the table and placed my hand briefly over hers. "Just thinking." She held my hand for a moment. Her grip was the grip of 38 years. "You've been in your study all morning," she said. "I saw James's boy going in earlier." "He's helping me with some documentation," I said. "Nothing pressing." She looked at me a moment longer, the way she did when she suspected there was more, but was choosing not to push. Then she nodded and reached for the bread. I watched my wife of 38 years eat lunch in the October light, and understood that the most difficult part of what was coming was not the legal proceeding, or the evidence, or the man in the gray suit, or even the senator whose name had appeared in my study that morning like a stone dropped into still water. The most difficult part was going to be telling Margaret the truth about what she had been given instead of it. The afternoon had turned cooler by the time I went out to the garden. It was past 2 o'clock. Franklin would not arrive until 4, which left me with a window of time that I did not want to spend in the study going over the same information I had already gone over 4 times. There is a point in the processing of difficult facts when additional review stops being productive and becomes a form of agitation dressed as diligence. I had reached that point. What I needed was air, and the particular quality of outdoor silence that Belle Meade afforded in October. Not true silence, but the layered sounds of wind and birds and the distant movement of the city beyond the property walls. Sounds that put human difficulty in its correct proportion. I found Darnell in the north section of the grounds, past the kitchen garden, in the long row of oaks that ran along the interior wall. He was working alongside his father, the two of them moving through the fallen leaves with rakes and a large canvas collection bag. Their movements synchronized in the way of people who have done the same work together many times. James Cooper was humming something. I recognized this. I had heard him hum before, or rather, I had registered the sound the way you register background noise without attending to it. Now I listened for a moment before I made my presence known. It was a hymn, I thought, though I could not have named it. Darnell saw me first. He said something quietly to his father, and James turned. James Cooper was 54 years old. I knew his age because it was in the employment records which I had reviewed once 12 years ago when he was hired, and not since. He was a lean man, careful in his movements, with the particular economy of someone who has spent decades doing physical work and has learned to spend himself efficiently. His face was weathered in the specific way of outdoor work, not aged beyond his years, but marked by them honestly. He was wearing a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, and his hands on the rake handle were the hands of someone who used them seriously. He looked at me with an expression I had not expected. Not surprise, not the mild professional alertness of an employee whose employer has come out to the garden unexpectedly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation and had not been certain it would come. "Mr. Cooper," I said. It struck me as I said it that I was not certain I had ever addressed him by name directly. I had said good morning in passing. I had said thank you when the grounds looked well kept before a gathering. I had not, in 12 years, said his name. "Judge Calloway," he said. His voice was measured, a Tennessee inflection worn smooth by time. "Your son came to see me this morning," I said. He nodded once. It was not the nod of a man receiving new information. "I thought he might," James said. We stood in the oak row for a moment. Darnell had set down his rake and moved a few steps back, giving us space with the same instinctive tact he had shown all morning in the study. The leaves around us were copper and amber, the kind of colors that photograph well and feel in person like something more significant than color. Like the year doing its honest accounting before it closed. "Tell me about him," I said. "Your son. What he's like." James looked at Darnell briefly, then back at me. "He reads everything he can get his hands on," he said. "Always has. When he was 9, he found your library through the window. He'd sit outside on that stone bench near the east garden and read whatever he'd brought from school. I told him to stay out of your way." A pause. "He found a way to be out of the way and still get close to the books." "He's been using the library," I said. "I didn't know that until recently," James said. "He told me a few months ago. He said you'd left the garden door unlocked one afternoon, and he'd looked in, and you'd told him he was welcome to use it." He paused again. "I don't know if that's exactly how it happened." It was approximately how it had happened. I had found him at the garden door one Saturday morning in June, looking at the shelves through the glass, with the focused attention of someone reading a menu in a restaurant they cannot afford. I had told him the door was open. I had not thought about it again. "He wants to study law," James said. It was a statement, not a question, but it carried the particular weight of a statement that has been held carefully for a long time and is being set down at last. "I know," I said. "He told me." "He's good enough," James said quietly. "He's better than good enough. He reads the way lawyers need to read, not to finish, but to understand. He argues with the books." A brief private smile. "I hear him at night in his room, talking back to whatever he's reading, like he's in a conversation with it." I looked at Darnell, who was standing a few feet away, examining a section of bark on one of the oaks, with the focused attention of someone who is very carefully not listening to a conversation about himself. "Mr. Cooper," I said, "your son came to me this morning with information that required considerable courage to bring. He told me he'd been carrying it alone for 3 weeks." James was quiet for a moment. The humming had stopped some time ago, and the garden had taken on the specific silence of a conversation that has arrived at its real subject. "I know what he heard," James said. "He told me. Not everything, but enough." His voice did not change in its measured quality, but something in it shifted, a tightening, barely perceptible. "I told him to stay out of it." "He told me that," I said. "He said he couldn't not." James looked at his hands on the rake handle. "He said that if something happened to you because he didn't say anything, he'd have to carry that. And he'd rather carry the risk of saying something." A pause. I didn't know how to argue with that. It's the same thing I would have said when I was his age, before I learned that saying things has consequences that don't always fall on the person doing the saying. I understood what he meant. The consequences of Darnell's decision, if things had gone differently, would not have fallen primarily on Darnell. They would have fallen on James, on the job, on the small house in the corner of the property that James and Darnell and the memory of a family occupied together. "You knew," I said, "about what was happening before Darnell came to me." James did not look away. "I saw things," he said carefully. "I'm on this property 12 years. You see things. I didn't know what they meant, not all of it, but I knew something was wrong." He paused. I told myself it wasn't my place. The words sat between us in the copper-colored afternoon. It was not a confession of cowardice. It was the honest accounting of a man who had made a calculation that most people in his position would have made, who had weighed the risk against the cost, and chosen the path that protected his son's stability and his own. It was the reasonable decision of a reasonable man in an unreasonable situation. And it had required his 16-year-old son to look at the same calculation and reach a different conclusion. It wasn't an easy position to be in, I said. James nodded. No, sir, he said. It was not. We stood in the oak row for another moment. The wind moved through the upper branches and brought down a small cascade of amber leaves that settled around our feet without ceremony. I'm glad he came to me, I said. James looked at his son. Darnell had given up pretending to examine the bark and was looking back at his father with an expression I recognized as the particular hope of a young person, waiting to learn whether the adult in front of them is going to do the right thing or the safe thing. So am I, James said quietly. Now that it's done. I did not sleep well. This was not unusual for me, in the way that insomnia is unusual for some people. An interruption of a normal pattern. A malfunction to be corrected. I had been a poor sleeper for most of my adult life, a condition the bench had neither caused nor cured, but had given a productive shape to. On the nights when sleep would not come, I had learned to work, and the work had been sufficient to make the sleeplessness feel purposeful, rather than simply empty. Now that the work was gone, the sleepless hours had become something else. Not quite emptiness, but a formlessness that I had not yet found a way to use. Last night had been different. Last night I had lain awake in the specific alertness of a man who has too much to think about and no action available to take before morning. Franklin had arrived at 4 as he had said he would. We had spoken for 2 hours in the study with the door locked, Darnell having returned to his father's house on the grounds after I had thanked him and told him to be available in the morning. Franklin had confirmed what he had told me on the phone and had added several details I had not had. He had left at 6 with the file from the safe and a list of calls he intended to make before dawn. Margaret had asked about the visitor at dinner. I had told her he was an old colleague consulting on a legal matter. She had accepted this. She had been quiet during dinner, in the way she sometimes was when she was thinking about something she had not yet decided how to raise. And I had been quiet in the way I was now, which was the quiet of a man managing a very large amount of information in a very small space. I was in the kitchen at 6:15 when I remembered the mail. I had not checked the previous afternoon's mail. This was not characteristic. I checked the mail with the regularity of a man who, having spent decades receiving documents of consequence, had developed a reflexive attention to anything delivered to his address. Yesterday had disrupted the routine. I pulled on my coat and went down the front path to the box at the gate. There were 3 pieces of mail. 2 were ordinary, a utility statement, a catalog from a garden supplier that Margaret subscribed to. The third was a manila envelope, letter-sized, with my name and address written by hand in Franklin's precise architectural printing. No return address. Postmarked Nashville the previous afternoon. I took it inside and opened it at the kitchen table before Margaret came down. The envelope contained 11 pages, paper-clipped in 2 groups. A handwritten note from Franklin on top read simply, "Confirmed overnight. Read the second section last." The first section was 7 pages. A summary document formatted with the spare efficiency of a federal case file. It detailed Derek Holt's documented interactions with Senator Harlan Briggs over a period of 38 months. 14 meetings, none logged through official channels. Each confirmed through a combination of surveillance records, financial documentation, and communications metadata that Franklin had obtained through means I did not examine too carefully. The financial relationship was structured through a Delaware limited liability company, registered in the name of a woman I did not recognize. Derek's name appeared only as a registered agent, a role technical enough to suggest plausible deniability and specific enough to leave a traceable record for someone who knew where to look. The amounts were not large. They were precisely not large. The specific calibration of payments designed to appear as consulting fees rather than compensation for a defined service. Someone with a detailed understanding of what draws federal attention had determined the threshold below which regular payments attract less scrutiny, and had set the amounts accordingly. It was patient, careful work. It was the work of a man who understood that the most durable arrangements are the ones that look from every angle like something else entirely. I set the first section down and picked up the second. It was 4 pages. The handwritten note had told me to read it last, which meant Franklin had known it would require the first section as context. I had learned over 22 years to follow Franklin's sequencing when he offered it. The first page of the second section was a timeline. At the top of the page, Franklin had written one line: Derek Holt's documented contacts with Margaret Calloway prior to meeting Claire Calloway. The timeline began 18 months before Derek had appeared in Claire's life. I read it twice. Then I set it on the table and looked at the kitchen wall for a moment. The particular unremarkable section of painted plaster above the counter that my eyes had settled on without intention, the way eyes do when a mind needs a neutral surface to process against. 18 months. Derek had met Margaret at a Tennessee Bar Association fundraising event. He had cultivated the acquaintance over 6 months through a series of interactions that the documentation described as low-frequency and high-deliberateness encounters, spaced widely enough to appear casual, specific enough in their content to suggest research. He had asked Margaret about her family. He had remembered details across months of intermittent contact. He had expressed interest in the kind of legal and civic matters that Margaret cared about, the kind that a man who had done his research would know she cared about. After 6 months, Margaret had mentioned him to Claire as a young attorney she had met through bar association events. A thoughtful person, someone Claire might enjoy meeting. That introduction had been the objective. Everything before it had been preparation. I thought about Claire. I thought about the version of her meeting Derek that she carried, the version in which it had been chance, or something close to chance, a meeting arranged by her mother because her mother thought they might get along. I thought about the 11 years she had built on that version, the ordinary faith she had placed in its foundation. I thought about what it meant that the foundation had been constructed specifically to bear her weight. The hearing document was at the bottom of the second section, a single page. Davidson County Probate Court, petition for determination of mental incapacity, filed under Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 34-1115. Petitioner, listed as Derek Allen Holt, son-in-law. Hearing date, Thursday, October 16th. Time, 10 o'clock in the morning. Tomorrow. I looked at the kitchen clock. 6:47 in the morning. Margaret would be down within the hour. Derek was presumably asleep in the guest room he used on his Nashville visits, 3 doors down the hall. The room where I had once stood in the doorway, watching him unpack a suitcase, and thought, with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who believes he is seeing his family clearly, that Claire had chosen well. 27 hours. I gathered the pages, replaced them in the envelope, and went to call Franklin. The call with Franklin had lasted 20 minutes. He had received my message before I sent it. He had been awake since 5, he said, which for Franklin was not unusual. He had confirmed the hearing filing and had used the word tomorrow in the flat, declarative tone of a man stating a fact he intends to do something about. He had 3 calls to make before 9 o'clock and would be at the house by 10. He had asked me one question before ending the call. Had I spoken to Claire yet? I had told him no. He had said simply that I should. I did not go back inside immediately after the call. Instead, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, then picked up my coat from the hook by the side door and went out to my car. Not to drive anywhere. The car was simply a place that was not the house. A sealed space with no history in it, no accumulated years of ordinary life pressing against the walls. No chance of Margaret's footsteps on the stairs, or Derek's particular way of moving through the downstairs rooms that I had spent 11 years cataloging without knowing I was doing it. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and found Claire's number. She answered on the third ring. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been awake for some time. Not groggy, but thinned at the edges. The particular vocal texture of a person who has been lying in the dark thinking rather than sleeping. "Dad," she said. There was something in the single word relief, I thought, or the anticipation of relief, which is almost the same thing. "Good morning," I said. "I'm sorry it's early." "It's fine," she said. "I've been up." I had spent 35 years learning when to speak and when to wait, and I waited now. Not long, 10 seconds, perhaps 15. Long enough for her to understand that the call had a shape to it, that I had called for a specific reason, and was giving her space to arrive at it alongside me, rather than delivering it like a verdict. She spoke first, which was what I had expected. "Something's happening, isn't it?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "I need you to tell me some things if you're willing, about the last 2 years, about Derek." A silence. Different from the earlier silence, this one had weight in it. The weight of something that has been held carefully for a long time and is now being offered a place to be set down. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Enough to ask," I said. "I want to hear it from you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she began to talk. She told me carefully, in the same way that people tell things they have been sorting through alone for a long time. Not in a rush, not with the performed emotion of someone who has been waiting for an audience, but with the measured precision of a person delivering a considered account. She had been doing this accounting privately, I understood, for at least as long as she had been standing in my garden on that Sunday, saying the words, "He's not who I thought he was," into a phone, while my son-in-law smiled at my groundskeeper 15 feet away. The changes had begun approximately 2 years ago, she said. They were not dramatic at first. Derek had become more secretive about his schedule, not in a way she could point to specifically, but in the accumulation of small evasions that added up over time to a pattern. Calls he took in other rooms. Meetings he described in the vague professional shorthand of a man who does not want to be asked follow-up questions. A new set of contacts in his phone, whose names she did not recognize, and whom he had never mentioned in the ordinary way that people mention professional acquaintances to their spouses. Then the documents had begun. Over a period of 8 months, Derek had presented her with 5 separate documents to sign. Each time he had described them in broad strokes: estate planning adjustments, financial restructuring, administrative paperwork related to his practice. Each time she had asked to read them fully, and he had accommodated the request, with a patience that she had initially read as transparency and had later come to understand as the patience of a man who had calculated that the documents would not be comprehensible to someone without specific legal training, and who was therefore comfortable with her reading them. She had signed 4 of the 5. The 5th she had declined, not because she understood it fully, but because something about the way Derek described it had not aligned with something he had said about a related matter 3 months earlier, and the inconsistency had been small enough that she could not name it, but large enough that she could not ignore it. Derek had not pressed her on the 5th document. He had said it could wait. He had been patient and pleasant about it in a way that had troubled her more than pressure would have. "I thought about calling you," she said. "Several times. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have anything concrete. I had feelings and inconsistencies and a document I hadn't signed. I know what you think of feelings and inconsistencies without evidence to support them." "Claire," I said. "I'm not blaming you," she said quickly. "I'm explaining why I didn't call." I understood why she was making the distinction. I also understood that the distinction did not make the weight of what she had carried alone any lighter, and that understanding that was my responsibility rather than hers. "I need you to come to Nashville," I said. "Tonight. Can you do that?" Another silence, shorter than the others. "Yes," she said. "Don't tell Derek you're coming," I said. "Tell him whatever you would normally tell him when you come to visit, that you're visiting your parents, that it's a routine trip. Don't give him a different reason, and don't give him no reason. Ordinary is what we need. She absorbed this without asking why, which told me she had already done enough thinking about Derek's capacity for attention to understand why ordinary mattered. "Dad," she said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not breaking, nothing so simple as that, but carrying something underneath it that I recognized as the voice of a person who has been waiting for permission to ask a question they have been afraid to ask. What did he do? I looked through the windshield at the front of the house. The October morning was gray today, the gold of yesterday replaced by the flat, even light of cloud cover. The kind of light that makes everything look its actual size, rather than the slightly enlarged version that direct sun produces. "Come tonight," I said. "I'll tell you everything when you're here." A pause. Then, "Okay, drive carefully," I said. "I will." Another pause, briefer. "Dad, is Mom all right?" I thought about Margaret at the lunch table yesterday. The grip of 38 years on my hand. The blue cardigan with the repair on the cuff. "She will be," I said. "That's what tonight is for." Claire arrived at 7:40 in the evening. I heard her car in the drive and went to the front door before she reached it. She had driven the 3 hours from Knoxville in the particular way she drove when something was pressing on her quickly, I suspected. Without the radio, the way she had driven as a young woman, when she needed the road to think on. She looked tired, in the specific way of someone who had been tired for a long time and had learned to carry it without showing it, and was now in the presence of someone who knew what to look for, not bothering to conceal it. We did not embrace immediately. We stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked at me with the eyes of a woman trying to determine how much worse the news was than she had prepared herself for during 3 hours of highway thinking. I could not give her the answer in the doorway, so I simply stepped aside and let her in. Franklin was already in the study. He had arrived at 6 earlier than planned, because one of the calls he had made that morning had yielded something he wanted to review before the evening. He had the leather folder open on the desk, and 3 separate documents laid out with the organized precision of a man who has spent decades preparing cases in rooms with inadequate table space. He looked up when Claire came in, and I made the introduction briefly. Claire knew of Franklin, had heard his name over the years, in the oblique way that children learn the names of their parents' professional world as part of the landscape, rather than as specific individuals. Darnell was in the corner of the study, in the small chair beside the bookshelf, with a yellow legal pad and a pencil. I had asked him to stay. He was 16, and he had started this, and it seemed to me that he had earned the right to see how it was being handled, and also that his presence in the room served a function I could not entirely articulate, but felt clearly. Something about continuity, about the line between what he had done that morning and what we were doing now. Franklin presented the legal strategy without preamble, which was his characteristic mode, and one that Claire, I noted, appeared to appreciate. 3 layers of evidence, he said. First, the audio recording, authenticated by a forensic sound analyst he had contacted that afternoon, confirming the recording had not been altered and that the voices matched known samples of Derek Holt's speech patterns. Second, the financial documentation establishing Derek's relationship with Senator Briggs, the Delaware LLC, the payment records, the meeting logs. Third, the fabricated medical file, which he was having analyzed by a physician colleague who could testify to its internal inconsistencies. Claire listened with her hands folded in her lap. She did not ask questions during the presentation, which told me she was processing rather than confused. When Franklin finished, she said one thing. "The documents I signed," she said. "Are they a problem?" "Potentially," Franklin said, with the honesty that made him valuable. "We'll know more after the hearing. The key issue is whether Derek can demonstrate sufficient legal standing to bring the competency petition, which requires medical documentation. The documentation is fabricated, and we can show that. Without it, the petition has no foundation." Claire nodded. She looked at her hands briefly, then back at Franklin. "All right," she said. I left them reviewing the documentation and went to find Margaret. She was in the sitting room at the end of the hall, the small room she used in evenings, the one with the 2 chairs angled toward the garden window, and the reading lamp that she had kept for 20 years because it threw the specific quality of light she preferred for the end of the day. She was sitting with a book open in her lap, but she was not reading. She was looking at the dark garden window, and her reflection looked back at her from the glass with an expression I could not fully read from the doorway. She heard me and turned. "Franklin is here," she said. It was not a question. She had heard the voices. "Yes," I said. I came in and sat in the chair across from her. The lamp threw its familiar light between us. "And Claire?" Margaret's expression shifted. Relief first at Claire's name, and then something more complicated beneath it. She set the book aside. "Raymond," she said. "Something is happening. I know something is happening. I've known since yesterday at lunch. Please tell me." I had thought carefully about Franklin's advice about sequence, about the order in which information lands, and what that order does to the person receiving it. I had decided that Margaret had been managed with careful sequences long enough, and that what she deserved now was the truth, delivered as directly as I could deliver it. "I need to ask you something first," I said. "And I need you to tell me everything in whatever order it comes to you. Not what you think I want to hear. What actually happened." She looked at me steadily. "All right." "Derek," I said, "what has he told you about my health?" The question landed in the room and settled. Margaret looked at the garden window for 2 seconds, then back at me. "He told me you'd been having episodes," she said. Her voice was careful, the voice of a person choosing words with awareness that they matter. "Forgetting things, becoming confused in conversations. He said he'd noticed it getting worse over the past year, and that he was worried, and that Dr. Whitmore had confirmed it." "When did he first tell you this?" 8 months ago," she said. "Maybe 9. She paused. "He came to me privately. He said he was telling me first because he didn't want to alarm you, and because he thought I needed to understand what was happening so I could help make the right decisions." "And the documents you signed?" I said. "He told you those were for my protection." Something moved across her face. Not guilt. Something closer to the particular grief of a person who has just understood in a new way the shape of something they already partly knew. "He said they were standard legal preparations," she said quietly. "That every family in our situation should have them in place. He said you'd already agreed to the framework in principle, but that there were details you found upsetting to discuss directly, and that it would be kinder to handle the administrative components without making you review every page." I did not speak immediately. I let the words sit in the room and do their work. "Margaret," I said. "He showed you something. A video, I think." She went very still. "How do you know about that?" she said. "Because the sequence you're describing requires something that would make a person of your judgment bypass your own skepticism," I said. "A verbal description of symptoms wouldn't have been sufficient. You would have asked to see evidence. So he showed you something." She looked at me for a long moment. Her hands, I noticed, had tightened in her lap. "He showed me a video on his phone," she said, "about 6 weeks ago. He said he'd recorded it because he was worried and wanted documentation. You were at dinner the Hendersons' anniversary. You seemed confused about something. The dates. You repeated yourself." She stopped. I recognized it. I remembered that evening. I remembered the Henderson anniversary. I had been tired. I had driven back from Murfreesboro that afternoon after a long meeting, and I had been less sharp than usual at dinner. I had repeated a story I had already told. It had been the unremarkable fatigue of a 68-year-old man at the end of a long day. "Margaret," I said, "I need you to find that video. Tonight." Whatever device he sent it to or showed it to you on, I need you to find it." She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has just moved from suspicion to understanding, and whose understanding has arrived with the specific weight of something that cannot be taken back. "Raymond," she said, and her voice had changed. "What did he do?" From the hallway, Darnell's name appeared on my phone screen. A text message. 4 words. "Mr. Holt just left." Then 3 seconds later, "He's carrying a briefcase." I put the phone face down on the side table. Derek and his briefcase could wait 20 minutes. Whatever he was doing with it, wherever he was going at 9 in the evening on the night before a hearing he believed he had prepared for thoroughly, he was not going anywhere that I could not account for. Franklin would want to know, and I would tell him. But first there was this room, and this woman, and the question she had just asked me. "He manipulated the footage," I said. "The video he showed you was constructed from real material, a recording of an actual evening, probably the Henderson dinner as you described, but edited to emphasize moments that, taken out of context, look like symptoms of cognitive decline. The repetition, the date confusion, those things happened. They didn't happen the way the video presents them." Margaret looked at me with the expression of a person receiving information they have already begun to suspect and are now having confirmed. It was not the expression of surprise. It was the expression of a woman who had been carrying a low-grade unease for some time and was now being given its name. "How do you know it was edited?" she said. "I don't yet," I said. "Not with certainty. But Franklin can determine it. He needs to see the video." I paused. "Do you still have it? Did he send it to you, or only show it to you on his phone?" She was quiet for a moment. "He sent it to me," she said. "After he showed it to me. He said I should have it, that I might need to show it to a doctor if Raymond became more confused." She said the words with a flatness that told me she was hearing them differently now than she had when Derek said them. She reached for her phone on the side table and scrolled for a moment. Then she stood and said she would get the tablet. She had saved it there as well. She thought because the screen was larger and she had wanted to be able to see it clearly. She left the room. I sat in the quiet of the sitting room and looked at the garden window, which showed me nothing but the dark and my own reflection. I heard faintly the voices of Franklin and Claire in the study at the end of the hall, the low, measured tones of a legal conversation, the particular cadence of people working through a problem with precision. Claire's voice had the quality I recognized from her childhood: focused, careful. The voice she used when she was thinking hard about something and had decided to think hard about it out loud. Margaret returned with the tablet. She handed it to me without speaking and sat back down in her chair. The video was 3 minutes and 14 seconds long. Derek had labeled it in her files with a date and the words, "Dad Henderson Dinner." The clinical efficiency of the label, Dad, not Raymond, not father-in-law. The shorthand of assumed intimacy struck me as I pressed play. The footage was shot on a phone. The image slightly unsteady in the way a video taken without a tripod, in a social setting. The Henderson sitting room was recognizable. The pale walls, the arrangement of furniture I had seen a dozen times, the particular quality of their chandelier light. I was seated at the far end of the room, in conversation with someone whose back was to the camera. I could see myself in the footage, clearly enough to register the tiredness in my posture, the slight forward lean of a man at the end of a long day, trying to give the appearance of full engagement. What the video showed was this. I repeated a story about a courthouse renovation in downtown Nashville that I had apparently already told earlier in the evening. I misstated the year that a mutual acquaintance of the Hendersons had retired, saying 2016, when the correct year was 2014. I paused mid-sentence twice, in a manner that could be read in isolation as a person losing the thread of their own thought. These things had happened. I did not doubt it. The Henderson anniversary had been on a Thursday in August, and I had driven from Murfreesboro that afternoon after 5 hours of consultation work, and I had arrived at the party tired, in the specific way of a man who has not eaten adequately since breakfast, and has been thinking at full capacity for most of the day. I had repeated myself. I had misremembered a date. I had paused when the word I wanted took a moment longer than usual to arrive. I called Franklin into the sitting room. He watched the video over my shoulder once through without comment, then asked me to replay the first 40 seconds. "The cut at 31 seconds, he said. "Watch the background lighting." I watched. At 31 seconds, there was a cut, subtle, disguised by a slight movement of the camera. The kind of edit that a non-professional would not catch in a single viewing. The lighting in the background shifted by a small but measurable degree between one frame and the next, indicating that the footage either side of the cut had been recorded at different times during the evening and assembled to appear continuous. "The repetition," I said. "The repetition was genuine," Franklin said. "But the gap between the first telling and the second telling was probably an hour or more. The edit makes it look like minutes. To a viewer who doesn't know what they're looking at, it reads as a man who cannot track what he has just said." He straightened and looked at Margaret. "I'll need a forensic analyst to confirm the metadata," he said. "That will show the file modification history and the source recordings. Do you know who edited this?" Margaret shook her head. Her hands were in her lap, very still. "Derek gave it to me," she said. "I don't know who made it." Franklin nodded. He took the tablet and went back to the study. I sat across from my wife in the sitting room, with the garden dark behind the window glass and the lamp throwing its familiar light between us. Margaret was looking at the space on the table where the tablet had been, and her face had the particular stillness of a person doing interior work that does not show on the surface. "I signed documents," she said finally, "believing I was protecting you." "I know," I said. "He told me you were declining. He showed me." She stopped, started again. "He gave me a reason that made sense. He made it feel like the responsible thing, the caring thing." "I know," I said again. She looked at me then, directly, in the way she had looked at me across 38 years of ordinary and difficult mornings. "I should have come to you," she said. "I should have asked you directly. I chose to believe a version that made it easier not to." I did not offer her an absolution she had not asked for. I understood that she was not looking for one. She was looking for honesty, which was the only thing I had left to give her that had not been in some way compromised by the events of the past 24 hours. "We have 9 hours," I said. "Franklin needs to work, and so do we. Tomorrow morning, we go to that courthouse, and we put this right." She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has absorbed what she needed to absorb and is ready to move forward. She picked up her book from the table beside the chair, not to read, but to have something in her hands. 9 hours, she said quietly. 9 hours, I confirmed. The vest was in the back of the closet, behind the suits I had stopped wearing when I retired. And the suits I had kept because getting rid of them would have required a decision I had not been prepared to make about what it meant to no longer be a person who wore them regularly. It was navy, a wool and silk blend that Margaret had bought me for a birthday I could not now precisely identify, sometime in the mid-2000s, one of the years when my birthday had fallen during a particularly demanding case, and she had given me something thoughtful, and I had thanked her with the distracted gratitude of a man whose mind was 2 floors down in a courtroom. I had worn it for important hearings. Not all hearings, only the ones where I had understood in advance that the day would require something of me beyond ordinary competence. I put it on at 6:45 in the morning and stood for a moment in front of the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at me was 68 years old, which I knew, and looked it, which I had made a policy of not avoiding. 68 years of mornings had produced a face that recorded them honestly. I did not think this was a disadvantage for today's purposes. Franklin had worked until 2 in the morning. The forensic analyst he had contacted, a woman named Harriet Oakes, who had testified in federal cases for 19 years, had confirmed the video metadata remotely by midnight. 3 source files modification timestamps showing edits made 6 weeks ago. A compression artifact pattern consistent with professional editing software. Franklin had the written confirmation on his laptop by 1 o'clock. He had slept, he said, for 4 hours on the study sofa. Which I did not entirely believe, but chose not to contest. Darnell's recording had been authenticated the previous afternoon. The audio analyst had confirmed no alterations and had identified Derek's voice against existing samples with a confidence rating he was prepared to testify to. We left the house at 8:15, Franklin driving myself in the passenger seat, Margaret and Claire following in Margaret's car. Darnell was not coming to the courthouse. I had asked him to remain at the property, and he had accepted this without objection. Before I left, I found him in the study, returning books to the shelf he had been reviewing. Sections of Tennessee probate law, he said, to understand the proceeding. I had looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then I had told him that what he had done on Tuesday morning had made today possible, and that I would not forget it. He had nodded and said he would be here when we got back. Davidson County Probate Court occupied the 4th floor of a building on 2nd Avenue that I had entered many times over the course of a career, but never as a party to a proceeding. The distinction felt significant in a way I had not anticipated. I had spent 35 years being the authority in rooms like this one. Walking into a courtroom as the subject of a petition was a different orientation entirely, and I took a moment in the elevator to register it clearly, rather than pretend it was not there. The hearing room was small. Probate proceedings did not require the architecture of criminal or major civil cases. 12 chairs for observers, 2 counsel tables, a bench elevated by 1 step rather than 3. Derek was already seated at the petitioner's table when we entered, with a lawyer I recognized by reputation, a Nashville estate attorney named Forsyth, who had built a practice on contested competency cases and was known for methodical preparation and an unexcitable manner in front of judges. Derek looked up when we came in. He looked at me for approximately 2 seconds before his expression reassembled itself into something neutral. In those 2 seconds, I saw something I had not seen before in 11 years of looking at my son-in-law's face. It was not quite surprise he had known I would be present. What it was, I decided, was the recalibration of a man who had planned for a specific version of the person in front of him and was now being presented with a different one. I was not the version he had planned for. Franklin set his leather folder on the respondent's table and arranged his materials with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done this thousands of times and has no interest in performing the preparation. I sat beside him. Margaret and Claire took seats in the observer section behind us, close together, shoulders nearly touching. The judge entered at 10:02. The Honorable Catherine Marsh, Probate Division, a compact woman in her late 50s, with the particular manner of someone who has presided over too many of these proceedings to be surprised by them, and who has developed, through that experience, a very accurate instrument for distinguishing the genuine from the manufactured. Forsyth presented Derek's petition with professional thoroughness. He introduced the medical documentation, Dr. Whitmore's fabricated assessment, formatted with the careful attention to official appearance that I had now had 2 days to examine in detail. He introduced the video. He called Dr. Whitmore to the stand. Whitmore testified in the clipped, overqualified manner of a man reading from a prepared statement, while trying to appear to be speaking from memory. The inconsistencies were there for anyone who knew what to listen for. Franklin knew what to listen for. He cross-examined Whitmore for 11 minutes. By the 4th minute, Whitmore had contradicted himself twice on the specific date of the examination. By the 7th, he had been unable to identify the correct hand in which he claimed to have observed tremor indicators, when Franklin asked him to confirm a detail from his own written report. By the 11th, he had fallen silent in response to a question about standard cognitive assessment protocols. The specific silence of a man who has run out of prepared answers. Franklin then addressed the judge directly and submitted 3 exhibits. The first was the audio recording, accompanied by the forensic authentication report. The recording of Derek's conversation on Raymond Calloway's East Terrace. The analyst's report stated was unaltered and contained Derek Holt's voice with a confidence level of 94.7%. The second was the financial documentation. The Delaware LLC records the payment history. The meeting logs establishing Derek's 3-year relationship with Senator Harlan Briggs, whose name in this room, in this context, produced a silence among the observers that had a different quality than ordinary courtroom quiet. The third was the video metadata analysis. 3 source files, professional editing software. A presentation designed, the analyst's written conclusion stated, to create a false impression of cognitive symptoms in the subject through selective juxtaposition of footage recorded at different times. Judge Marsh read each exhibit summary in the silence that followed their submission. She read slowly, which I had learned over 35 years meant she was reading carefully rather than performing the appearance of reading. When she finished the third document, she set it on the bench and looked up. She looked at Derek for a long moment. Derek looked at me. I looked back at him with the same composure I had brought to 35 years of difficult days in rooms like this one. Not performance, not triumph. Simply the steadiness of a man who has done what the day required and is waiting for the proceeding to run its course. The room was very quiet. Judge Marsh set the third document down on the bench and folded her hands. The silence in the room had a particular quality that I recognized from 35 years of watching juries and judges arrive at conclusions. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of a mind that has completed its work and is preparing to deliver it. It was the silence that came after the analysis was done and before the language began. I had heard it hundreds of times from the other side of the bench. Hearing it from this side was a different experience, and I allowed myself to register the difference clearly rather than pretend it was familiar. She looked at Forsyth first. "Counselor," she said, "the medical documentation submitted in support of this petition has been substantially undermined by the cross-examination of the certifying physician and by the forensic analysis submitted by the respondent. Dr. Whitmore was unable to confirm basic details of the examination he purportedly conducted, including the specific laterality of the symptom he documented as the primary clinical finding. This court does not find the medical record credible." Forsyth had the composed expression of a professional absorbing an adverse ruling. Not surprise, but the careful neutrality of a man deciding in real time how much of his preparation remained usable. "Additionally," Judge Marsh continued, "the video evidence submitted by the petitioner has been shown through forensic metadata analysis to be a composite of footage recorded at different times, edited to produce a misleading impression of the respondent's cognitive state. The submission of this material in support of a competency petition is a matter the court takes with considerable seriousness." She paused. She looked at Derek. "The petition for determination of mental incapacity is denied," she said. "The medical record submitted in support of this petition is referred to the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners for review. The financial documentation submitted by the respondent establishing an undisclosed relationship between the petitioner and a sitting state official is referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Tennessee." She looked at the back of the room. I had not seen them enter. 2 men in dark suits had positioned themselves near the door during Franklin's presentation of the third exhibit, their presence unobtrusive enough that the proceeding had continued without interruption. They moved forward now with the specific economy of people executing a planned action. No hurry, no drama. The professional precision of a thing that has been rehearsed. The senior agent addressed Derek by his full name and informed him that he was being detained for questioning in connection with a federal investigation. He said it in the flat, declarative tone that federal agents use, the tone that conveys neither emotion nor apology, because it contains neither. Derek stood. He stood slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man who is determining in real time what his options are, and arriving at the conclusion that they are limited. Forsyth said something quietly in his ear. Derek nodded once. He did not look at Margaret. He did not look at Claire's empty chair in the observer section. She had not come into the courtroom, had waited in the hallway at my request. Because there are things a person does not need to watch, and the arrest of the man they married is one of them. He looked at me. It lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I saw a man completing the recalibration he had begun when I walked into the room in the navy vest. The version of Raymond Calloway he had planned for the version he had spent months preparing, documenting, managing through Whitmore and video and carefully worded conversations with Margaret, had not appeared today. A different version had appeared. He was looking at the difference now, and he was understanding with the specific intelligence that had made him effective at the work he had chosen, that the difference was not recoverable. He said nothing. He allowed the agents to guide him toward the door with his hands at his sides, and he did not look back. The room exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. No one spoke. No one moved suddenly. It was the collective release of people who have been holding a specific kind of attention and have been given permission to release it. Forsyth began gathering his materials with the methodical efficiency of a professional moving to the next matter on his calendar. Judge Marsh made several notes on the record and adjourned without further comment. Franklin placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. He said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said between us, and he understood that. I stood. The room looked different from standing than it had from sitting, which I noted without assigning significance to it. It was simply a different angle, and angles change what you see. I walked to where Margaret was standing near the end of the observer row. She had not moved during the ruling or the arrest. She was standing with her hands at her sides, and her face had the expression I had seen on her face perhaps a dozen times in 38 years. The expression that came when something large had happened, and she was letting it land before she decided how to hold it. I stood beside her. We did not speak. After a moment, she placed her hand on my arm, not the grip of the lunch table, not the pressure of a woman communicating urgency. A different pressure. The weight of a hand that is simply present, that has chosen to be present, that is placing itself where it is because that is where it belongs. We walked together into the hallway. Claire was standing by the window at the far end. She had her back to us, looking out at the street below 2nd Avenue in the October morning. Ordinary traffic, ordinary Tuesday life, proceeding without reference to what had just happened on the 4th floor. She had her arms crossed lightly over her chest, not defensively, but in the way of a person holding themselves together with quiet deliberateness while they wait for news they have already partially anticipated. She heard our footsteps and turned. She looked at my face first, then at Margaret's, then back at mine. She was asking a question without asking it, and my face gave her the answer. And for a moment, she simply stood there, receiving it. The particular stillness of a person who has been braced for something and is now processing the fact that the thing has passed. The morning light came through the courthouse window and fell across the hallway floor in a long, pale rectangle. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I said. She nodded once. Then she looked at the window again, at the ordinary street below, and I saw in the line of her shoulders the specific posture of a woman who has just been handed back something she did not know she had lost until this moment, and does not yet know how to carry it differently than she carried the absence. The victory was real. I did not pretend otherwise. But standing in that hallway, watching my daughter look at a street she had looked at her whole life and see it with different eyes, I understood that real victories are rarely simple, and that the work that remained, the long, patient work of people finding their way back to each other across the distance that had been deliberately placed between them, was not the kind of work that courtrooms could complete. That work would take longer, and it would be harder in some ways than anything the last 4 days had required, but it would be done. Margaret had gone with Franklin to a small conference room at the end of the hall. There were documents to review, procedural matters that required her signature and her attention. The administrative aftermath of a legal proceeding that does not pause because the emotional proceeding is still in progress. I had watched them go, and then stood for a moment in the hallway with the pale rectangle of window light on the floor and my daughter's back to me at the far end. I walked toward her. She heard my footsteps on the courthouse tile and did not turn immediately, which I understood. There are moments when a person needs to finish something internal before they can turn around, and watching me walk toward her through a courthouse hallway was information that required a moment's processing before it could be received as straightforwardly as it appeared. She turned when I was perhaps 10 feet away. Her eyes were dry. I had expected this. Claire had learned to cry privately, a habit she had developed in adolescence and had never entirely abandoned. She would have done whatever she needed to do in the hours of waiting in this hallway, and by the time I reached her, it would be behind her, organized into something she could carry forward, rather than something that was happening to her in the present tense. What was in her face was not grief exactly. It was something more complex than grief, the specific expression of a person who has had the structure of a significant part of their life revealed as something other than what they believed it to be, and who is standing in the moment just after that revelation, trying to determine what the correct orientation toward it is. I stopped beside her at the window. We both looked out for a moment at 2nd Avenue below. A delivery truck was double-parked outside the building across the street. A woman in a red coat was walking a small dog with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has nowhere to be for the next 40 minutes and is finding this pleasant. The city was conducting its ordinary business with complete indifference to the 4th floor of the building above it. "Did you know?" Claire asked. "Before Tuesday." "No," I said. "Not until Darnell came to me." She nodded slowly. She had known the answer before she asked it. I could tell by the way the nod came without surprise. A confirmation rather than a reception. 2 years, she said. I spent 2 years knowing something was wrong and not being able to name it clearly enough to say it out loud to anyone. She paused. I kept thinking that if I could just get it into a form that was specific enough, a fact, something I could point to, then I could bring it to you. Or to someone. Another pause. I had feelings, and a document I hadn't signed. I didn't think that was enough. It might have been, I said. You would have asked me for the evidence, she said. Not with bitterness, with the plain accuracy of a woman who knows her father. I did not argue with this. She was right, and she knew she was right. And arguing with it would have been a way of avoiding the thing I actually owed her, which was acknowledgement. You're right, I said. I would have. And that was a failure of, not of instinct exactly, of flexibility, of understanding that the person I was talking to was my daughter and not a witness. I paused. I taught you without meaning to that feelings without evidence aren't worth bringing to me. That was the wrong lesson. I'm sorry for it. She looked at me with the expression of a person who has been waiting to hear something said clearly and is now hearing it, and is not certain immediately what to do with it. Not because it was unwelcome, because it was the kind of thing that once said reorganized other things, and the reorganization took a moment. He was good at it, she said finally. Derek. He was very good at making everything feel like it had a reasonable explanation. Every time I tried to hold something up to the light and look at it directly, there was a reason. A plausible, specific, individually reasonable reason. She looked at the window. It was only when you put all the reasons together that they stopped making sense. But by then, I'd already accepted each one separately. That's how it works, I said. That's precisely how it's designed to work. She was quiet for a moment. The woman in the red coat had passed out of view. The delivery truck remained where it was. 11 years, she said quietly. Not as a complaint, as an accounting. The specific arithmetic of a woman calculating what a number means now that its context is changed. I did not offer her a reassurance about the 11 years. I did not tell her that some of it had been real, or that not all of it had been manufactured, or that she should look for the genuine parts and hold on to them. Those things may or may not have been true, and it was not my place to determine the proportions, and she would need time and privacy to do that work herself and do it honestly. What I did was place my hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, the kind that belongs to the physical vocabulary of fathers and daughters. Unremarkable in itself, but which had become over the years of her adult life and my working life, and the gradual accumulation of distance between them, less common than it should have been. My hand on her shoulder, in a courthouse hallway on a Thursday morning in October, felt different from the gesture it would have been 10 years ago. Because 10 years of infrequency had made it mean something that frequency would have distributed across many moments and made ordinary. She leaned into it, not heavily, not the lean of someone who needs to be held up, the lean of someone who is choosing to accept something being offered, which is a different thing entirely, and requires in its own way more. You weren't wrong that something was wrong, I said. You were just wrong about what you could fix alone. She exhaled a long, quiet breath, the kind that carries something out of a person, that has been sitting in them pressed against their ribs. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, we go home. She straightened. She looked at me with the eyes she had had at 8 years old, sitting in my study chair, with her feet not reaching the floor, reading a book she did not fully understand, because she wanted to be in the same room as the work I was doing. Okay, she said. We walked back down the hallway together toward the conference room where Margaret and Franklin were waiting. Our footsteps the only sound in the corridor. The October light coming through the windows at the angle it takes when the morning is almost done and the afternoon is still to come. We returned to Belmead at 12:30. The drive back was quiet, in the way that drives are quiet after the thing they were building toward has occurred. Not the anticipatory quiet of the morning, which had had a tensed quality to it. The quiet of people conserving themselves for what was coming. But the different quiet of afterward, which is looser and more various. Franklin rode with us. He spoke briefly about next steps. The referrals to the federal and medical boards would take their own time, he said, and there would likely be additional proceedings before everything was resolved. But the immediate threat had been addressed, and the documentation was in the right hands. He said it in the flat declarative tone he used for facts, and then he was quiet too. Margaret sat in the back seat beside Claire. I did not hear them speak during the drive, but at some point during the 40 minutes on the interstate, I glanced in the mirror and saw that Margaret had placed her hand over Claire's on the seat between them, and that Claire had turned her hand over so that they were holding on, rather than simply touching. Neither of them was looking at anything in particular. They were just sitting with their hands together in the October afternoon light, which was doing what it did in Tennessee in mid-October, making everything look in that particular amber way like something that will be worth remembering. I found Darnell in the kitchen garden. He had not been idle in our absence. The kitchen garden's winter preparation was half finished. The raised beds cleared, the soil turned, the cold frames set up along the south wall, with the care of someone who understood that the work done in autumn determines what is possible in spring. He was kneeling at the far end of the longest bed when I came through the garden gate, and he looked up at the sound of the latch with the alert attention of a young man who had been waiting without quite admitting to himself that he was waiting. He stood. He looked at my face, which I allowed to give him the information before I spoke it. And I watched the information arrive, the loosening around his shoulders, the quiet exhale, the particular expression of a person receiving news they had hoped for, but had not permitted themselves to count on. "It's over," he said. "The hearing is over," I said. "The rest will take time." But yes, he nodded. He looked down at his hands, the garden soil still on them, the specific evidence of an afternoon's honest work. And then back up at me. "Come sit down," I said. "I want to talk to you." We sat on the stone bench along the garden wall, the one that caught the afternoon sun and held its warmth longer than the surrounding stone. It was the same bench where in June I had found Darnell looking through the library window with the focused attention of someone reading a menu in a restaurant they could not afford, and had told him the door was open. I had not thought about that moment in the months since. I was thinking about it now. "What are you reading?" I said. He looked at me for a moment, slightly surprised by the question's direction. Then he reached into the large pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a book, the kind of worn paperback that has been read many times and shows it honestly, the spine creased in several places. A section of pages near the middle held by a rubber band because the binding had given way at that point. Constitutional Law, Principles and Practice, 3rd edition. The cover had a library sticker on the lower right corner from the Nashville Public Library, long since deaccessioned. It was from my shelves. I recognized the sticker. I had acquired several books through library sales over the years, and this had been among them. "Chapter 9, he said. Equal Protection. I've read it 3 times, and I think I understand it. And then I read it again, and I'm not sure I do." "That's the correct response to Chapter 9, I said. "Anyone who reads it once and thinks they understand it hasn't understood it." He looked at the book in his hands. "It's yours," he said. I should have asked. "Keep it," I said. He looked up. "It does better work in your hands than it was doing on my shelf," I said. I meant this precisely, without sentiment. The book had been sitting behind glass for 4 years. Whatever understanding it was capable of producing had been static for that entire period. In Darnell's hands, with the spine creased and the rubber band holding the middle pages and the evidence of 3 readings of Chapter 9, it was doing the thing books are made to do. We sat for a moment in the afternoon sun. In the far garden, I could hear James working the particular sound of the leaf blower he used in the sections where the rake was insufficient. Steady and methodical. "I spoke to Franklin this morning," I said, "before the hearing. About you." Darnell was very still. "There is a scholarship fund that I established several years ago, administered through Vanderbilt Law School, for students from Davidson County who demonstrate exceptional aptitude and insufficient resources." I paused. "Franklin tells me the application deadline for next year's cycle is in February. I would like to nominate you." Darnell looked at me with an expression I could not immediately classify. Not surprise exactly, though surprise was part of it. Something more layered. The expression of a person who has been wanting something for long enough that the offer of it requires a moment to be believed. "I'm 16, he said. "The scholarship is for undergraduate study as well," I said. "Pre-law. There's a pipeline program that begins in the senior year of high school." I paused. "February gives us time to prepare the application properly. I would help you with it." He looked at the book in his hands, then at the garden wall, then back at me. "Why are you doing this?" he said. I had expected the question. I had thought about the answer during the drive back, in the loose quiet of the aftermath, while Margaret and Claire held hands in the back seat, and Franklin was silent beside me. "Because on Tuesday morning," I said, "you walked through a door that most people your age, most people of any age, would have walked past. Not because they didn't see what was on the other side of it, but because seeing it and deciding to act on what you see are two entirely different exercises, and the second one costs something, and most people do the arithmetic and decide the cost is too high. I paused. You did the arithmetic differently, I said. You decided that what was right was worth more than what was safe. I have spent 35 years trying to build institutions that reward people who make that decision. The least I can do is make sure one of them has the tools to act on it at the highest level. Darnell was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud passed. James's leaf blower stopped, and the garden went quiet. And in the quiet, I heard faintly the hymn, the one James hummed while he worked, the one I had never been able to name. My dad taught me that, Darnell said finally. What you said, about doing what's right. I know, I said. That's the second reason. He looked at me. Your father has been on these grounds for 12 years, I said. I owe him a conversation I should have had years ago, and a salary that reflects what this property would look like without him. I paused. I intend to have both. Darnell looked at the book in his lap. He ran his thumb along the creased spine, the particular gesture of someone who is thinking through their hands. He'll say you don't have to, he said. I know, I said. I'm going to do it anyway. A week passed. It passed in the way that weeks pass after significant events. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular texture of time that has been returned to its ordinary shape after being stretched into something it was not designed to hold. The legal proceedings continued, in the hands of people whose job it was to continue them. Franklin called twice with updates. I noted and filed. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners had opened a formal review of Dr. Whitmore's conduct. The United States Attorney's Office had confirmed receipt of the financial documentation. These things were moving forward, with the methodical patience of institutions doing their work, which was slower than human urgency preferred and more durable than human urgency produced. Derek was no longer in the house. Margaret and Claire had spent 3 days at Belmead after the hearing. 3 days of the particular quiet that follows the removal of a pressure that has been so constant you stopped registering it as pressure. They had cooked together in the kitchen for the first time in years. They had sat in the garden in the late afternoons in the 2 chairs that faced the oak row, talking in the low, unhurried way of women who have been given back time they did not know they had lost. I had watched them from the study window on the second afternoon and thought that I was seeing something being rebuilt, slowly and honestly, without the shortcuts that false foundations offer. On the Thursday morning, 1 week after the hearing, I sat down at my desk with a blank piece of paper, not to write a will. I had thought about that. The document, the title of this story, points toward the thing that had been unsigned, because I had not yet understood what it should contain. What I understood now was that the document I had been putting off was not a legal instrument. It was a different kind of accounting. The kind that a man does when he has been given an unexpected view of his own life from a perspective he did not choose, and has learned things he did not know he needed to learn. I looked at the blank paper for a while. Then I wrote 4 names: Darnell, James, Claire, Margaret. I sat with those 4 names and thought about what each of them had cost something to do in the past week, and what each of them had given me by doing it, and what I owed each of them that I had not previously understood I owed. Darnell had carried a recording for 3 weeks in a jacket that was too large for his shoulders. Through 3 weeks of school days and ordinary evenings, and the specific loneliness of a person who knows something that nobody around them knows, and had chosen to walk through a door on a Tuesday morning because he had decided that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was comfortable. He had made that decision without knowing whether I would believe him, without knowing whether believing him would make any difference, without any assurance that the cost of speaking would be distributed fairly between the person speaking and the person the speech was for. James had spent 12 years maintaining the grounds of this property with a consistency and care that I had received as background and returned as almost nothing, not unkindness, not cruelty, simply the particular inattention of a man who had decided, without examining the decision, that some people in his life were present in a way that required acknowledgement, and others were present in a way that required only adequate compensation. He had taught his son something I had apparently not taught my daughter, which was that the moment to speak is when the speaking matters, not when it is convenient or certain or safe. Claire had spent 2 years in the specific loneliness of a person who can feel something is wrong, but cannot yet name it clearly enough to share it, and had carried that loneliness partly because of a lesson she had learned from watching me work, that feelings without evidence are not the kind of thing you bring to Raymond Calloway. I had spent 35 years building an instrument of extraordinary precision, and had failed to understand that the precision was a professional asset and a personal liability simultaneously, and that the people who loved me had organized themselves around it in ways I had not seen, because I had not looked. Margaret had believed a lie, because the lie had been constructed from true materials, and delivered by someone who understood her well enough to find the angle from which it would be most persuasive. She had done what most people do when they are managed carefully by someone they trust. She had accepted the version of events that was given to her, because she had no reason to construct a different one. Her error had not been credulity. It had been the ordinary human condition of seeing what you were shown and not seeing what is kept from you, which is not a failure of character, but a condition of being human in a world where other humans sometimes choose to exploit it. I sat with these 4 names and this accounting for a long time. Then Darnell knocked at the study door. He came in with the diffidence he had never entirely lost in this room. The slight pause at the threshold that belonged to a young man who had been told he was welcome, and was still, at some level, verifying that this continued to be true. He was carrying the constitutional law book under his arm. He had a question about Chapter 11, he said, the Commerce Clause, the limits of federal regulatory authority. A section he had read twice and was not certain he was reading correctly. I stood up from the desk. I went to the shelves and ran my finger along the spines until I found what I was looking for. A smaller volume, older. The kind of supplementary text that law professors assign and students read with more attention than they give the primary material. Because it is written by someone who has lived inside the doctrine rather than simply organized it. I had used it in the first years on the bench when the Commerce Clause questions were genuinely difficult and the official commentary was insufficient. I took it from the shelf and held it out to him. This will help with 11, I said. Read it alongside Chapter 11, not before. The sequence matters. He took it with the careful handling of someone who has learned that books are objects that reward being treated with respect. Thank you, he said. He looked at the desk, at the paper with the 4 names on it, then away, the quick, tactful look of a young man who has understood that there are things on other people's desks that are not his to read. Darnell, I said. He looked up. What your father taught you, I said. About doing what is right. About speaking when speaking costs something. That is not a small thing. In 35 years of watching people decide whether to tell the truth in rooms where telling it was difficult, I have seen that quality in perhaps 1 person in 20. Perhaps fewer. He held the book against his chest and did not speak because he understood that I had not finished. The work you want to do, I said, requires that quality more than it requires anything else I could help you develop. The law is learnable. The willingness to stand in a difficult place and say what is true when saying it costs something, that is not taught in classrooms. You came to this already carrying it. I paused. Don't let the education take it from you. He nodded. It was the nod of someone who had heard something they intended to keep. He left. I heard his footsteps on the hallway floor, and then the sound of the side door, and then the particular quality of silence that a room takes on after a person has just left it. I went to the window. The grounds of the Belmead property were doing what they always did in late October. settling into their winter shape. The oaks nearly bare now, the kitchen garden put to bed for the season, the stone paths clear and clean in the morning light. James was at the far end of the south garden, moving along the wall with a measured pace, the hum of whatever he hummed carrying faintly through the glass. The property looked exactly as it had looked a week ago. The oaks were the same oaks. The stone wall was the same stone wall. The morning light was doing what morning light does in Tennessee in late October, arriving at a low angle, making the ordinary things cast longer shadows than they did in summer, giving everything a slight gravity that did not belong to the things themselves, but to the quality of the light falling on them. I looked at it, and I saw it differently than I had a week ago. Not because it had changed. Because I had spent 4 days being shown by a 16-year-old boy and his father, and my daughter, and my wife, the specific difference between looking at your life and seeing it, between receiving the presence of people who have organized themselves around you and actually knowing who those people are, between building something over 35 years and understanding what you have built and what it is worth and what it requires of you to be worthy of it in return. The paper with the 4 names was still on the desk behind me. I did not sign it. There was nothing to sign. It was not a legal document. It was a record of understanding arrived at late, which is not the same as arrived at never, and which carries its own obligation not to regret the lateness, but to act from the understanding as clearly and as promptly as whatever time remains allows. Outside, James had stopped moving along the wall. He was standing still in the south garden, looking up at the oak branches with the particular attention of a man assessing what a tree needs before a winter comes. He had been doing this for 12 years. He would go on doing it now, with the knowledge that the person who owned the property he tended had finally looked back at him and seen him clearly. Which is not everything a person needs, but is not nothing either. I thought about Darnell walking back to his father's house with 2 books under his arm, and a question about the Commerce Clause, and something else I hoped he was carrying the understanding that the thing he had done on a Tuesday morning in October had mattered, had been seen, had been received by someone who understood what it had cost, and was trying, in the time remaining to him, to be worth the cost. I thought about Claire in the back seat of Margaret's car, holding her mother's hand in the amber October light, doing the long, slow work of deciding what to keep from 11 years and what to set down, and how to tell the difference. I thought about Margaret on the morning after the hearing, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the garden catalog she subscribed to, turning pages with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who has returned to her own life after a period of distance from it and is finding it still habitable, still worth the tending. The most important things I had learned in 35 years on the federal bench had not come from cases or precedents or the accumulated weight of judicial doctrine. They had come from the people who moved through my life doing their work honestly and carefully while I was looking at something else. I had been looking at something else for a long time. I was looking at this now. If this story has stayed with you, I would ask you to consider one thing before you move on to whatever comes next in your day. Not a grand question, a small one. Think about the people who have been present in your life in ways you may have received as background. The consistent ones, the quiet ones, the ones who show up without announcement and do what they do and expect nothing particular in return. Consider whether you know them as clearly as they deserve to be known. Consider whether you have told them what their presence has meant, or whether you have assumed, as I assumed for too long, that the presence itself communicated it. And if there is someone in that category who has not heard from you in a while, not because anything is wrong, but simply because the days went forward and the words did not, perhaps today is the day to say the thing you have been meaning to say. Some things keep. Some things are better said while there is still time to say them well. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening on Male Revenge. Tonight's story reminds us that justice does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives quiet and patient. Scripture says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." We do not repay evil with evil. We stand on the truth and let the Lord do the rest. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Male Revenge and press the bell for the next story. God bless you and your family.